The ocean world of Tidebreak shimmered under twin moons, its silver waters stretching endlessly beneath a sky filled with distant stars. Ambassador Ravi Sharma walked along the underwater memorial path, his pressure suit humming softly as it maintained the air bubble around him. Schools of luminescent fish darted past, their bodies glowing in patterns that almost seemed like language. Above him, through hundreds of feet of clear water, he could see the lights of human ships in orbit, their presence a constant reminder of how far humanity had traveled in just 3 centuries. The monument rose from the ocean floor like a piece of Earth itself, carved from pure white marble transported across light years for this single purpose. 37 names were etched into its surface, each letter precise and deep enough to last for millennia. Ravi placed his gloved hand against the cold stone and felt the weight of 200 years pressing down on his shoulders. Around him, the Kelvin people gathered in the thousands, their translucent bodies flowing through the water like living glass. Bioluminescent patterns rippled across their forms, creating waves of blue and green light that the human translators interpreted as respectful silence. Elder Witness Mira approached slowly, her ancient body flickering with pale light. Unlike the younger Kelvin, whose colors shifted rapidly with emotion, her glow was steady and dim, like a candle burning its last hours. She had been alive when it happened, Ravi knew. She had been one of the few who witnessed the sacrifice firsthand. Ravi activated his external speakers, his voice carrying through the water in carefully modulated sound waves. He spoke of Europa, Jupiter's frozen moon, and the research station humanity had built there in their early clumsy days of space exploration. He spoke of the reactor experiment that went wrong, of the meltdown that would have cracked the moon's ice shell and destroyed everything humanity had built. He spoke of the Kelvin science vessel that had been observing from a safe distance, studying these strange new creatures who walked on land and breathed poisonous oxygen. The Kelvin had every reason to leave. The humans had caused the disaster themselves through their own reckless inexperience. Galactic law was clear on such matters. Each species was responsible for its own mistakes. No one would have blamed the Kelvin for maintaining safe distance and simply recording the tragedy for future study. Instead, 37 Kelvin scientists had entered the failing station. Their water-based biology gave them slightly more resistance to radiation than human bodies could manage, but only slightly. They had moved through corridors filled with lethal energy, their bodies already beginning to break down at the cellular level, and manually sealed each reactor valve. The process took 6 hours. All 37 died within 3 days, their bodies literally dissolving from the inside out. But they had saved 200 human lives and prevented a catastrophic explosion that would have set Earth's space program back by decades. Ravi finished his speech and bowed deeply, a gesture the Kelvin had learned to recognize as profound respect. The gathered thousands responded with a synchronized pulse of golden light, their species' highest expression of honor. The ceremony should have ended there, with the annual remembrance complete and the diplomatic protocol satisfied. But Elder Witness Mira pulsed a private request for conversation. Ravi followed her away from the monument, swimming through structures of living coral that the Kelvin shaped into their cities. They entered a chamber that amplified sound naturally, allowing for private discussion without electronic interference. Mira's patterns shifted to a deep purple that the translators marked as grief and resignation. Through the translation device built into Ravi's helmet, her voice emerged as a gentle, water-soft whisper. She told him what the Kelvin government had been hiding for 3 years, what their astronomers had confirmed and reconfirmed with growing dread. A supernova had erupted thousands of light years away, long before humans had even discovered fire. Its radiation wave had been traveling through space at nearly the speed of light, sterilizing empty systems and dissipating slowly across the cosmic distances. By terrible chance, its path would intersect with Tidebreak's system in exactly 3 years. The Kelvin sun's magnetic field, weakened by age, would offer no protection. The wave would strip away their atmosphere and boil their oceans into steam. Ravi felt his blood run cold. He asked the obvious question: what was their evacuation plan? How many could humanity help relocate? Earth had 13 colony worlds now, several with large bodies of water that could be adapted for Kelvin habitation. Mira's response shocked him into silence. The Kelvin had no evacuation plan. Their philosophy? developed over 400,000 years of peaceful existence, held that when a species' time ended, it should face that end with dignity and grace. They would spend their final years in celebration of their long history, and when the wave came, they would meet it together in their ancestral waters. She spoke of it calmly, as if discussing the changing of seasons rather than the extinction of an entire civilization. Ravi's hands were shaking. He asked if this was truly what all Kelvin wanted, or just the decision of their elders. Mira admitted that many of the younger generation struggled with the choice, but respect for tradition and the wisdom of their elders kept them from protesting too loudly. Besides, where would they go? Relocation would mean abandoning their homeworld forever, living as permanent refugees in alien environments. Perhaps a clean ending was preferable to a slow cultural death among the stars. Ravi thanked Mira for her honesty and requested permission to relay this information to Earth. She granted it, her light patterns suggesting she expected nothing more than symbolic gestures of sympathy. After all, what could humanity do? They were still a young species, barely established in their corner of the galaxy. The resources required to save an entire planet from a radiation wave would be astronomical. Perhaps impossible even for the great powers of the Galactic Assembly. She did not understand humanity yet. Within 6 hours of receiving Ravi's emergency transmission, Earth's Remembrance Council had convened in full session. Director Paulo Mendez stood before the assembled representatives, his dark eyes reflecting the images on the screens behind him. The Europa Station, the 37 names, the medical reports describing how the Kelvin bodies had broken down. His grandmother's name had been on the list of humans saved that day. He had built his entire career around a single principle: humanity must never forget those who saved them. The Council's vote was unanimous. Earth would save Tidebreak, regardless of cost. The declaration was transmitted across all human channels and to the Galactic Assembly within the hour. On worlds across human space, people stopped their daily routines to watch the announcement. The Remembrance Council's motto appeared on every screen: "We remember, we return, we never forget." The Galactic Assembly met in emergency session, their chambers filled with representatives from hundreds of species. The Draconith Hegemony's warlord Scales, his reptilian features twisted in disbelief, demanded to know if humanity understood the implications. The economic cost alone would set Earth back decades. The resources required could build entire colonies. For what, an ancient debt? A symbolic gesture? Director Paulo stood before them all and played the final transmissions from the Kelvin scientists. Their voices, translated from the chemical signals they used to communicate, spoke of hope that their sacrifice would build friendship between species. They spoke of their families and their dreams for a galaxy where young species like humanity would be welcomed and protected. They spoke of their choice to value life over safety, connection over isolation. Paulo's voice was steady as he addressed the assembly. Humanity had learned from the Kelvin what it meant to put principle above calculation. They had learned that some debts could never be measured in credits or resources. They had learned that civilization required more than just technology and trade. It required memory, honor, and the courage to act when action seemed impossible. Earth would save Tidebreak. The work began immediately. On the ocean world, Elder Witness Mira watched the human transmissions with patterns of color that had no translation. The younger Kelvin-like drift clustered around their elders, asking if this was real, if the humans truly meant to attempt the impossible. Mira pulsed an affirmative, her old body glowing brighter than it had in years. Perhaps some species were different after all. Perhaps memory was more powerful than she had believed. Perhaps humanity would teach the galaxy something that had been forgotten in the endless cycles of rise and fall. That honor was not a weakness, but a strength, and that debts remembered across centuries could reshape the future itself. The stars above Tidebreak shone coldly, indifferent to the drama below. But among those stars, human ships were already accelerating toward assembly points, carrying materials and equipment and thousands of volunteers. The impossible had been declared possible by a species too, stubborn to accept fate's verdict. The Kelvin watched and wondered what they had truly saved 200 years ago on a frozen moon circling a distant gas giant. The Himalayan arcology rose 7 miles into the thin atmosphere, its crystalline spires catching the first light of dawn and scattering it across the valleys below. Deep inside its engineering levels, Chief Engineer Yuki Tanaka had not slept in 3 days. Her workspace was chaos. Holographic displays showing orbital mechanics, resource calculations, and structural simulations floated in overlapping layers around her desk. Empty food containers littered the floor, and her black hair had escaped its tie to hang in messy strands around her face. She barely noticed. The numbers finally worked. Project Stellar Shield materialized in the central display as she compiled her final presentation. The electromagnetic lattice array would stretch across 5,000 kilometers of space, forming a geometric web of 4,800 interconnected nodes. Each node would house fusion reactors, quantum processors, and field generators working in perfect synchronization. Together they would create an artificial magnetosphere, powerful enough to bend the incoming radiation wave around tide break, like water flowing around a stone. The physics were sound. The engineering was theoretically possible. The practical reality was insane. Yuki transmitted the completed proposal to the Galactic Assembly's Science Council and allowed herself exactly 10 minutes to close her eyes. When she woke, the responses were already flooding in. 12 different species had analyzed her designs. All 12 concluded the same thing: impossible within the time frame. Impossible with available resources. Impossible for a species as young as humanity to coordinate. Just impossible. The formal presentation took place in the Assembly's Grand Chamber, a space designed to accommodate species of wildly different sizes and atmospheric requirements. Yuki stood in an Earth-standard environment bubble. Her presentation projected large enough for beings ranging from the massive, silicon-based Stoneheart Collective to the microscopic swarm entities of the Hive Collective to observe. She walked them through each phase. The resource requirements made several delegates physically recoil. 400 million tons of processed metals, 50,000 quantum processors, each requiring rare elements that humanity had only recently learned to refine. 2,000 fusion cores operating at power levels that pushed material science to its limits. The construction would require 80,000 workers maintaining 16-hour shifts for nearly 3 years straight, working in the hostile environment of space with zero margin for error. The Hive Collective's spokesperson, a shimmering cloud of coordinated insects, buzzed its analysis into the chamber's translators. Their calculations showed that even if humanity devoted its entire industrial capacity to the project, they would need to increase production efficiency by 300%. Their colonies would suffer shortages. Their economy would contract by an estimated 40%. Their position in the galactic community, built carefully over 3 centuries, would crumble as resources were diverted from trade and development. The logical alternative, the Hive continued, was to offer the Kelvin resettlement assistance. Humanity could transport perhaps 10 million Kelvin to suitable worlds over the next 3 years. The rest, sadly, would perish, but such was the mathematics of available resources versus time. This was the rational response. This was what any mature civilization would choose. Warlord Scales of the Draconith hegemony rose from his heated platform, his scales clicking together in what his species considered laughter. His people valued strength above all else, and they measured strength in military power and resource control. To them, humanity's proposal represented the weakest possible response, sacrificing your own strength to save those who could not save themselves. It was the behavior of prey animals, not predators, worthy of respect. Director Paulo Mendez requested the floor. He was a small man, physically unremarkable compared to many of the species present, but when he spoke the chamber fell silent. He had brought footage, he explained. Original recordings from the Europa incident, preserved in Earth's historical archives. He asked permission to show them. The images filled the chamber's central display. The Kelvin scientists moved through the failing reactor complex, their translucent bodies already showing signs of damage. The radiation counters in the footage showed readings that should have killed them instantly, yet they persisted. One scientist's body began to lose cohesion, parts of him literally dissolving. Yet he completed his task of sealing a coolant valve before allowing his colleagues to help him to safety. Another worked for 3 hours with her internal organs visibly failing, her bioluminescence flickering like a dying star. The final transmission played in the silence. The Kelvin mission leader's voice, translated from chemical signals to human language, spoke to his crew. He acknowledged that they were all dying. He acknowledged that they had chosen this knowing the cost. He said that if this was to be their last act, let it be one that proved the value of life over calculation, of compassion over cold logic. Let it show the humans and the galaxy that civilization meant something more than survival. Paulo's voice was quiet when the footage ended. He explained that these recordings were required viewing for every human child when they reached the age of understanding. They learned the names of all 37 Kelvin. They learned what was sacrificed. They learned what honor looked like when it wore an alien form. Humanity would save Tidebreak, Paulo continued, because the Kelvin had taught them that some things mattered more than spreadsheets and profit margins. They had taught humanity what it meant to be part of a civilization, rather than just a species occupying space. If repaying that debt bankrupted Earth's economy, so be it. Resources could be rebuilt. Honor once lost could never be recovered. The assembly adjourned in confused disarray. By the time they reconvened the next day, something remarkable had begun to happen across human space. Volunteer registrations crashed government servers within hours. Construction workers from the asteroid mining colonies of Belt Prime signed up in such numbers that the colonies had to implement a lottery system to decide who could go. Engineers from Mars, where humanity's largest shipyards operated, abandoned lucrative private contracts to offer their services freely. Students barely out of their training programs forged documents to make themselves appear qualified enough to join the workforce. The civilian response overwhelmed even the optimistic projections. A retired construction supervisor on Titan mortgaged her home to buy supplies and ship them to the assembly point. A child on Earth sent his entire savings, 43 credits, with a note explaining that the Kelvin had saved his great-great-grandmother. Mining corporations that normally competed viciously began coordinating their operations, sharing techniques and resources to maximize output. The lunar factories, built during humanity's expansion into their own solar system, had been partially mothballed as production moved to more distant locations. Now they roared back to life, their managers working around the clock to recall retired workers and train new ones. Mars announced it would convert 3 of its 5 military shipyards to civilian production, effectively weakening its defensive capacity to build components for the lattice array. Within 1 week, humanity had 80,000 registered volunteers ready to travel to Tidebreak. Within 2 weeks, they had the materials for the first construction phase either assembled or in transit. Within a month, the first components were being welded together in orbit above the Kelvin homeworld. But not all the responses were from humans. The Stoneheart Collective, ancient beings whose bodies were crystalline silicon and whose thoughts moved slowly but deeply, sent a private transmission to Director Paulo, their spokesperson, a massive creature whose voice resonated like singing crystal, explained that his people also understood the weight of ancient debts. 50,000 years ago, another species had shown them kindness when they needed it most. That species was now extinct, but the Stoneheart had never forgotten. They offered their deepest drilling mining equipment, machines that could extract materials from the cores of dead moons. They offered their expertise in large-scale construction, earned over millennia of building structures that lasted for geological ages. They offered these things freely, asking nothing in return except that humanity remember, debts outlive empires, and honor transcends species. Even some Draconith, those who valued personal honor over their empire's official stance, began sending anonymous donations through neutral third parties. Warlord Scales would have executed them for weakness, but they did it anyway. The display of commitment had touched something in them that their philosophy claimed did not exist. The Hive Collective, while maintaining their position that the project was mathematically irrational, offered something unexpected: their logistical coordination matrices. These were the algorithms that allowed billions of individual insects to work as one perfect organism. They explained in their buzzing mechanical way that they were offering this for pure scientific interest. They wanted to see if emotional determination could overcome mathematical probability. They made it clear this was an experiment, not support, but they offered the algorithms anyway. On Tidebreak, the Kelvin watched the galaxy's response with patterns of light that shifted between awe and disbelief. Elder Witness Mira addressed her people from the deepest trench, where the oldest and wisest Kelvin gathered. She spoke of the ancient choice her predecessors had made on Europa, a choice that had seemed simple at the time: save lives, or preserve safety. They had chosen to save lives. never imagining it would ripple across 2 centuries to return in a form that might save their entire world. Young Drift, the biologist fascinated by solid form life, began documenting everything. She recorded the human ships arriving in endless streams. She noted their work schedules, their safety protocols, their strange insistence on taking rest periods even when time was critical. She watched them make mistakes, correct them, and continue without the despair that seemed logical after setbacks. In her research notes, she wrote a question that would later become famous across the galaxy. What happens when a species builds their civilization not on strength or calculation, but on memory? What happens when they refuse to forget? Above tidebreak, the lattice array began to take shape. It looked fragile at first, just metal frameworks drifting in the dark. But day by day, shift by shift, it grew. The impossible was becoming merely improbable. And if humanity had proven anything in their short existence, it was that they had never learned to respect the word impossible. Space above tidebreak had transformed into something that resembled a small city scattered across thousands of kilometers. Transport ships arrived every 6 hours in precisely timed windows, their cargo bays releasing construction materials that floated in designated zones until work crews could retrieve them. The electromagnetic lattice array stretched across the void like a metal skeleton, its framework glowing with running lights and the bright flares of welding torches. Lead Field Commander Olaf Hansen reviewed the day's progress from the bridge of the flagship Endeavour, his weathered face illuminated by status displays. He was a massive Norwegian man whose white hair and beard made him look like some ancient god of winter, though his mind worked with the precision of a quantum computer. He had worked construction on every hostile environment humanity had colonized: the sulfur clouds of Venus, the crushing gravity of Jupiter's moons, the radiation-soaked surface of Mercury after it had been partially terraformed. This was harder than all of those combined. The work schedule he had implemented was brutal by necessity. 16-hour shifts in rotating teams, with 8 hours for rest, meals, and equipment maintenance. Every worker wore pressure suits that could keep them alive in vacuum, but felt like wearing a coffin after the 10th hour. The work itself required precision measured in millimeters, while dealing with objects that massed thousands of tons and moved through 3-dimensional space with no up or down to orient by. The galactic observers, positioned in their ships at safe distances, predicted catastrophic failure within the first month. They expected accidents, equipment malfunctions, and the slow breakdown of human will as the reality of the task set in. Their psychology experts published papers explaining that sapient beings simply could not maintain the necessary focus and determination for such an extended period. Burnout was inevitable. They did not account for what Olaf called the Europa Protocol. Every single safety procedure from the incident 200 years ago had been analyzed, improved, and implemented into the Stellar Shield construction guidelines. Redundant life support systems. Triple-checked structural integrity. Mandatory buddy systems where no worker ever operated alone. Emergency evacuation procedures drilled until they became muscle memory. The protocols actually slowed construction by 20%. Olaf had fought with the schedule planners over it, his voice carrying through the command center like thunder. They could not save the Kelvin by killing themselves. They would not trade one extinction for thousands of human deaths. If that meant taking longer, working harder, then so be it. His word was final. 6 months into construction, the lattice array had reached 30% completion. The main structural framework was solid, with 440 nodes already in place and operational. Work crews had found their rhythm, moving through space with the coordinated grace of dancers. Teams specialized. Some focused on framework assembly, others on installing fusion cores, still others on the delicate work of calibrating quantum processors. Kelvin observers were allowed to visit the construction site under heavy escort. Young Drift came up in a specially designed transport bubble that maintained water pressure and temperature. Through the transparent walls, she watched humans work in vacuum, their movements purposeful and efficient. She saw them pause mid-task to correct alignment by fractions of a degree. She saw them complete a weld, inspect it, find it inadequate, and cut it apart to start over. One human worker noticed her watching. He was young, probably barely into his 20s by human standards, his face visible through his helmet. He waved at her, then gestured at the lattice structure they were building. Through the translation system, his words came to her as chemical signals. For your people. Worth getting right. Drift recorded it all. In her notes, she wrote, "They do not seem to understand failure as a permanent state. They view each setback as information rather than defeat. When something does not work, they modify their approach and try again. This should be exhausting. Instead, it seems to energize them. I do not understand this species." The first major disaster struck during the 7th month. Tidebreak's sun, already unstable and weakening, erupted with a massive solar flare. The radiation wave tore through Section 7 of the lattice array, melting components that had taken 3 months to construct and install. 42 workers were caught in the blast. Their suits' radiation shielding, designed for normal space work, was overwhelmed in seconds. Emergency protocols activated immediately. Ships rushed to evacuate the injured. Medical bays across the human fleet went to crisis mode. Of the 42 caught in the flare, 6 died before they could be reached. Another 17 suffered radiation damage severe enough that they would never work in space again. The remainder would recover but needed extensive treatment. The galactic observers updated their probability calculations. Project failure was now 94% likely. Humanity would abandon the effort within 2 weeks. Once they held memorials for their dead, and came to terms with the cruel reality that some tasks truly were impossible. Chief Engineer Yuki Tanaka arrived at Tidebreak 3 days after the disaster. She had been overseeing construction of components at Mars, and had taken the fastest ship available the moment she heard about the flare. She came to the Endeavor without sleeping, reviewed the damage reports, and called a meeting of all section chiefs. Her eyes were red from exhaustion and grief, but her voice stayed steady. She pulled up the lattice design and began marking changes. Every section would now include emergency radiation shields that could deploy in milliseconds. Every node would have isolated power systems so a failure in one would not cascade to others. The quantum processors would be rearranged to provide real-time solar monitoring and prediction. The modifications would add 2 months to the construction timeline. They would require materials not currently in the supply chain. They would increase the complexity of an already overwhelmingly complex project, and they were not optional. Section 7 reconstruction began within a week. The new design was safer, more robust, and actually more efficient than the original. The workers returned to their tasks with the 6 dead honored in a ceremony that every human on every ship attended. Their names were added to the monument on Tidebreak, beside the 37 Kelvin scientists. The message was clear. This project was worth dying for, but it was not worth dying stupidly for. The Hive Collective updated their calculations again. Human efficiency was not decreasing as predicted. It was increasing. They were learning from every mistake, adapting their techniques, improving their coordination. The mathematical models had no variable for this kind of iterative improvement. The best approximation they could create was evolutionary pressure, but evolution worked across generations, not weeks. Warlord Scales watched from his war cruiser, positioned at the edge of the system. His tactical officers provided daily briefings on the construction progress. He had expected to witness a noble failure, perhaps even respect the attempt before it collapsed. Instead, he was watching something that challenged every principle his civilization had built over 10,000 years. In a private communication to his most trusted advisors, he admitted something that would have been political suicide to say publicly. If they succeed, they prove that compassion can be as powerful as conquest. They prove that keeping ancient promises can matter as much as keeping territory. Our entire philosophy is threatened by this insanity. And I cannot look away. Against all protocols and against the explicit wishes of the Remembrance Council, the Kelvin insisted on helping. They could not work in vacuum, but they could contribute their mathematical understanding. For 400,000 years they had lived in oceans, studying currents and flows and the complex interactions of electromagnetic fields in conductive water. On Tidebreak, the Kelvin watched the galaxy's response with patterns of light that shifted between awe and disbelief. Elder Witness Mira addressed her people from the deepest trench, where the oldest and wisest Kelvin gathered. She spoke of the ancient choice her predecessors had made on Europa, a choice that had seemed simple at the time: save lives or preserve safety. They had chosen to save lives, never imagining it would ripple across 2 centuries to return in a form that might save their entire world. Young Drift, the biologist fascinated by solid-form life, began documenting everything. She recorded the human ships arriving in endless streams. She noted their work schedules, their safety protocols, their strange insistence on taking rest periods even when time was critical. She watched them make mistakes, correct them, and continue without the despair that seemed logical after setbacks. In her research notes, she wrote a question that would later become famous across the galaxy. What happens when a species builds their civilization not on strength or calculation, but on memory? What happens when they refuse to forget? Above tidebreak, the lattice array began to take shape. It looked fragile at first, just metal frameworks drifting in the dark. But day by day, shift by shift, it grew. The impossible was becoming merely improbable. And if humanity had proven anything in their short existence, it was that they had never learned to respect the word impossible. Space above tidebreak had transformed into something that resembled a small city, scattered across thousands of kilometers. Transport ships arrived every 6 hours in precisely timed windows, their cargo bays releasing construction materials that floated in designated zones until work crews could retrieve them. The electromagnetic lattice array stretched across the void like a metal skeleton, its framework glowing with running lights in the bright flares of welding torches. Leadfield Commander Olaf Hansen reviewed the day's progress from the bridge of the flagship Endeavour, his weathered face illuminated by status displays. He was a massive Norwegian man whose white hair and beard made him look like some ancient god of winter, though his mind worked with the precision of a quantum computer. He had worked construction on every hostile environment humanity had colonized: the sulfur clouds of Venus, the crushing gravity of Jupiter's moons, the radiation-soaked surface of Mercury after it had been partially terraformed. This was harder than all of those combined. The work schedule he had implemented was brutal by necessity. 16-hour shifts in rotating teams, with 8 hours for rest, meals, and equipment maintenance. Every worker wore pressure suits that could keep them alive in vacuum, but felt like wearing a coffin after the 10th hour. The work itself required precision measured in millimeters, while dealing with objects that massed thousands of tons and moved through three-dimensional space with no up or down to orient by. The galactic observers, positioned in their ships at safe distances, predicted catastrophic failure within the first month. They expected accidents, equipment malfunctions, and the slow breakdown of human will as the reality of the task set in. Their psychology experts published papers explaining that sapient beings simply could not maintain the necessary focus and determination for such an extended period. Burnout was inevitable. They did not account for what Olaf called the Europa Protocol. Every single safety procedure from the incident 200 years ago had been analyzed, improved, and implemented into the Stellar Shield construction guidelines. Redundant life support systems, triple-checked structural integrity, mandatory buddy systems where no worker ever operated alone, emergency evacuation procedures drilled until they became muscle memory. The protocols actually slowed construction by 20%. Olaf had fought with the schedule planners over it, his voice carrying through the command center like thunder. They could not save the Kelvin by killing themselves. They would not trade one extinction for thousands of human deaths. If that meant taking longer, working harder, then so be it. His word was final. 6 months into construction, the lattice array had reached 30% completion. The main structural framework was solid, with 1,440 nodes already in place and operational. Work crews had found their rhythm, moving through space with the coordinated grace of dancers. Teams specialized. Some focused on framework assembly, others on installing fusion cores, still others on the delicate work of calibrating quantum processors. Kelvin observers were allowed to visit the construction site under heavy escort. Young Drift came up in a specially designed transport bubble that maintained water pressure and temperature. Through the transparent walls, she watched humans work in vacuum, their movements purposeful and efficient. She saw them pause mid-task to correct alignment by fractions of a degree. She saw them complete a weld, inspect it, find it inadequate, and cut it apart to start over. One human worker noticed her watching. He was young, probably barely into his 20s by human standards, his face visible through his helmet. He waved at her, then gestured at the lattice structure they were building. Through the translation system, his words came to her as chemical signals. For your people. Worth getting right. Drift recorded it all. In her notes, she wrote, "They do not seem to understand failure as a permanent state. They view each setback as information rather than defeat. When something does not work, they modify their approach and try again. This should be exhausting. Instead, it seems to energize them, I do not understand this species. The first major disaster struck during the 7th month. Tidebreak's sun, already unstable and weakening, erupted with a massive solar flare. The radiation wave tore through Section 7 of the lattice array, melting components that had taken 3 months to construct and install. 42 workers were caught in the blast. Their suits' radiation shielding, designed for normal space work, was overwhelmed in seconds. Emergency protocols activated immediately. Ships rushed to evacuate the injured. Medical bays across the human fleet went to crisis mode. Of the 42 caught in the flare, 6 died before they could be reached. Another 17 suffered radiation damage severe enough that they would never work in space again. The remainder would recover but needed extensive treatment. The galactic observers updated their probability calculations. Project failure was now 94% likely. Humanity would abandon the effort within 2 weeks. Once they held memorials for their dead and came to terms with the cruel reality that some tasks truly were impossible. Chief Engineer Yuki Tanaka arrived at Tidebreak 3 days after the disaster. She had been overseeing construction of components at Mars and had taken the fastest ship available the moment she heard about the flare. She came to the Endeavor without sleeping, reviewed the damage reports, and called a meeting of all section chiefs. Her eyes were red from exhaustion and grief, but her voice stayed steady. She pulled up the lattice design and began marking changes. Every section would now include emergency radiation shields that could deploy in milliseconds. Every node would have isolated power systems, so a failure in one would not cascade to others. The quantum processors would be rearranged to provide real-time solar monitoring and prediction. The modifications would add 2 months to the construction timeline. They would require materials not currently in the supply chain. They would increase the complexity of an already overwhelmingly complex project, and they were not optional. Section 7 reconstruction began within a week. The new design was safer, more robust, and actually more efficient than the original. The workers returned to their tasks with the 6 dead honored in a ceremony that every human on every ship attended. Their names were added to the monument on Tidebreak, beside the 37 Kelvin scientists. The message was clear. This project was worth dying for, but it was not worth dying stupidly for. The Hive Collective updated their calculations again. Human efficiency was not decreasing as predicted. It was increasing. They were learning from every mistake, adapting their techniques, improving their coordination. The mathematical models had no variable for this kind of iterative improvement. The best approximation they could create was evolutionary pressure, but evolution worked across generations, not weeks. Warlord Scales watched from his war cruiser, positioned at the edge of the system. His tactical officers provided daily briefings on the construction progress. He had expected to witness a noble failure, perhaps even respect the attempt before it collapsed. Instead, he was watching something that challenged every principle his civilization had built over 10,000 years. In a private communication to his most trusted advisors, he admitted something that would have been political suicide to say publicly. If they succeed, they prove that compassion can be as powerful as conquest. They prove that keeping ancient promises can matter as much as keeping territory. Our entire philosophy is threatened by this insanity, and I cannot look away. Against all protocols and against the explicit wishes of the Remembrance Council, the Kelvin insisted on helping. They could not work in vacuum, but they could contribute their mathematical understanding. For 400,000 years they had lived in oceans, studying currents and flows and the complex interactions of electromagnetic fields in conductive water. The observation deck of the Endeavor hummed with tension as Chief Engineer Yuki Tanaka displayed the updated timeline across the main screen. 2 years and 6 months had passed since construction began. The lattice array stretched across space in a geometric web that could be seen from Tidebreak's surface with the naked eye during night hours. 80% of the 4,800 nodes were complete and operational. The fusion cores generated power that made the entire structure glow with contained energy. They were ahead of schedule. The impossible had become merely improbable, and now probability was shifting against them again. Yuki's voice was calm as she explained what their deep space sensors had detected. The radiation wave from the supernova was moving faster than original calculations predicted. Not by much. Just 3% above the initial measurements, but 3% of near light speed across cosmic distances. meant the wave would arrive 5 months earlier than expected. They had 4 months remaining, not 9. The final 20% of construction had to be completed in half the planned time. Commander Olaf stood from his chair, his massive frame somehow seeming larger in the low light of the observation deck. He pulled up the workforce rotation schedules and began making changes in real time. Every available human in the sector would be called in. Off-duty military personnel, merchant ship crews, even the teenagers who had just barely passed their spacewalk certifications would be invited to volunteer for the final assembly. The call went out across all human channels. Within 12 hours, the response was overwhelming. Every military ship that could be spared from patrol duty arrived at tidebreak. Merchant vessels suspended their trading routes and brought their crews. The teenagers came with parental permission slips and eager determination, ready to be part of history. The construction zone transformed into something resembling controlled chaos. At any given moment, 100,000 humans worked in synchronized efforts across thousands of kilometers. Supply ships arrived and departed in 15-minute windows. Their choreography managed by the Hive Collective's algorithms and human determination in equal measure. The schedule was brutal, 18-hour shifts now with only 6 hours for rest. Medical staff raised concerns about exhaustion-related accidents. Olaf listened, then implemented mandatory stimulant monitoring and random performance tests. Anyone who showed signs of dangerous fatigue was pulled from rotation immediately. No arguments permitted. Some workers protested. Olaf reminded them that dead workers could not finish the array. The Galactic Assembly sent observers to document what they expected to be humanity's final desperate failure. Among them was Scribe Hollowbone, a skeletal being whose species had recorded galactic history for 2 million years. His multiple crystalline eyes captured everything. The workers moving through vacuum like schools of fish, the supply chain operating with mechanical precision, the way humans communicated through gestures when radio channels became too crowded. Hollowbone floated through the construction zone in his environmental sphere, watching a young human woman named Alex calibrate a quantum processor, while her partner held her tether. The work required such delicate precision that one mistake would require starting over. She had been at it for 4 hours, her hands moving with patient determination inside her suit's manipulator gloves. When she finally completed the calibration and gave the success signal, her partner whooped so loud it probably echoed through every radio channel in the sector. Hollowbone recorded it all. In his notes he wrote, "I have documented wars that reshaped galactic borders. I have witnessed first contacts between species that changed the course of civilizations. I have recorded the rise and fall of empires that lasted 1,000,000 years. But I have never seen an entire species collectively refuse reality's verdict. They do not simply build a shield. They build a monument to the irrational beauty of loyalty." On Tidebreak's surface, the Kelvin prepared for either salvation or extinction. Elder Witness Mira had ordered the evacuation of all surface cities, with everyone retreating to the deepest trenches as a precaution. But they did not prepare as refugees expecting doom. They prepared as people expecting salvation. Children asked their parents to explain the glowing web above their world, and parents told them stories of 37 heroes and the humans who never forgot them. Young Drift no longer spent her time just observing. She had become something like a liaison between the Kelvin and the construction crews. She translated not just words but cultural context, helping humans understand what their efforts meant to her people. She had watched enough now to understand something fundamental about humanity. They did not save the Kelvin because it was easy or profitable. They saved them because they had promised themselves they would, and humans treated promises like physical laws. In her latest research compilation, she included interviews with Kelvin of all ages. One stood out, an elder named Current who had been skeptical of the project from the beginning. He said, "I thought they would fail. I thought their sentiment would crash against reality and break. I was wrong. They are teaching the galaxy that reality can be bent if enough beings care enough to bend it together." Director Paulo Mendez reviewed the financial reports in his quarters aboard the diplomatic vessel. The numbers were devastating. Earth's economy had contracted by 38%. 3 colony projects had been indefinitely postponed. Medical research that would have saved thousands of human lives had been delayed by a decade. Infrastructure improvements across a dozen worlds had been canceled. He received a message from Earth's Civilian Oversight Council. They had conducted a poll across all human worlds and stations. Approval ratings for the Remembrance Council and Project Stellar Shield stood at 97%. The 3% who disapproved were mostly economists who understood numbers better than they understood honor. Even they admitted they would not stop the project if they could. Attached to the message was a personal note from a woman on Earth. Her name was Helen Rodriguez, and she was a teacher. She wrote that she had just finished teaching her class about the Europa incident and the Stellar Shield project. One of her students, a boy named David who was 9 years old, had asked a question. If we save the Kelvin, will they remember us the way we remembered them? Helen had answered yes, she thought they would. David had seemed satisfied with that answer. He had gone home and donated his birthday money to the Stellar Shield Fund. 43 credits. It would not buy much, but it was everything he had. Paolo read the message 3 times, then saved it to his personal files. When historians asked him years later why humanity had bankrupted itself for an ancient debt, he would show them that message. Sometimes the answer to complex questions was simple, because it was right, and because children like David needed to grow up in a galaxy where honor mattered. Engineer Yuki Tanaka conducted the final systems check during the last week of construction. Every node had to be inspected, every connection verified, every processor calibrated. The lattice array was complete, a perfect geometric web spanning 5,000 kilometers. The 4,800 electromagnetic nodes formed patterns that would make any mathematician weep with joy. The 2,000 fusion cores generated a combined power output greater than 10 suns, all precisely controlled and balanced. The quantum processors calibrated the field strength in real time, ready to respond to the exact radiation signature of the incoming wave. The system had redundancies for the redundancies. Emergency protocols could activate in milliseconds. Every lesson learned from the Section 7 disaster had been incorporated into the final design. It was the most complex defensive structure ever built by any species in galactic history. And it had been constructed in 2 years, 9 months, and 13 days by a species that the galaxy had considered barely competent when they started. Yuki transmitted the final verification to Commander Olaf. All systems operational. All nodes responding within optimal parameters. The shield was ready. Now they just had to wait for the wave. The last construction crews evacuated to safe distances over the following days. Ships positioned themselves in carefully calculated orbits that would let them observe while remaining protected. The Kelvin gathered in their deepest cities, their bioluminescent patterns creating light shows visible from orbit as they expressed hope, fear, and gratitude in equal measure. The radiation wave became visible in deep space sensors a week before arrival. It appeared as a wall of impossible colors, wavelengths that human eyes had never evolved to see but instruments could detect. It had traveled for thousands of years, sterilizing empty systems, its energy barely diminished by the vast distances. 3 uninhabited planets had already been stripped of their atmospheres by its passage. On the final day, absolute silence fell across the human fleet. 100,000 workers who had spent nearly 3 years building the lattice array watched their creation stand between death and an entire species. They had given everything, their time, their safety, their health. Some had given their lives. 6 names on the monument beside the 37 Kelvin. Ambassador Ravi Sharma stood beside Elder Witness Mira in her city in the deepest trench. Through his helmet he could see her bioluminescent patterns flickering rapidly, cycling through colors faster than the translators could interpret. He reached out and placed his gloved hand against the transparent wall of his suit. On the other side, Mira extended a tendril of her body to touch the same spot. No words were needed. They had been said already, 200 years ago and in the countless work shifts that built the shield. Now there was only waiting. Above tidebreak, the lattice array began to power up to full capacity. The fusion cores ignited in sequence, each one adding to the total until the entire web blazed with contained stellar fire. The electromagnetic field generators activated, and space itself seemed to shimmer as invisible forces stretched across thousands of kilometers. The radiation wave approached at nearly the speed of light, an unstoppable cosmic force that had been traveling since before human civilization existed. In its path stood a web of metal and light and human determination, built by beings who refused to accept that some debts were too expensive to repay. The galaxy watched to see which would prove stronger, the indifferent physics of the universe, or the stubborn loyalty of a species that always remembered. The radiation wave hit Tidebreak's star system like the fist of an angry god. Every sensor across the human fleet registered the impact simultaneously. A wall of cosmic radiation spanning wavelengths from hard gamma rays to exotic particles that most species had never even named. It appeared in the visual spectrum as colors that should not exist, as if the universe itself was screaming in shades that biological eyes had never evolved to process. The lattice array activated at full power in the same instant. The electromagnetic field blazed to life, forming a shimmer across space like a soap bubble made of light and mathematics. The 4800 nodes synchronized perfectly, each one contributing its precisely calculated portion to the overall field. The 2000 fusion cores operated at maximum capacity, pouring out energy that bent space itself around Tidebreak. In the Endeavor's command center, Chief Engineer Yuki Tanaka watched readouts that scrolled faster than human eyes could follow. The quantum processors analyzed the incoming radiation signature and adjusted field strength in real time, compensating for variations in the wave's intensity. Power consumption climbed into red zones past design specifications, pushing every system to its absolute limits. Node 847 in the northern quadrant flickered. For one terrible heartbeat, its power output dropped by 30%. Alarms screamed across every ship. If one node failed, the gap in the field would allow radiation through, and the cascade effect could collapse the entire array. 50 engineers watched their displays in frozen horror. Then the node stabilized. The backup systems, the redundancies that Yuki had insisted on after the Section 7 disaster, kicked in automatically. Power flow rerouted through secondary channels. The node output returned to optimal levels within seconds. The field held. Commander Olaf released a breath he had not realized he was holding. His hands were locked on the armrests of his command chair so tightly that his knuckles were white. Around him, his bridge crew maintained their positions with professional calm, but he could see the fear in their eyes. They had built something extraordinary. Now they would discover if extraordinary was enough. Deep in Tidebreak's oceans, the Kelvin felt the electromagnetic pulse as pressure against their fluid bodies. Their cities, built in the deepest trenches, were miles below the surface, but the field was so powerful it reached even there. Above them, through all that water, the sky had turned into a light show that transformed night into day. Elder Witness Mira gathered her people in the central chamber of the ancient city. Her bioluminescent patterns were steady now, showing a calm she forced herself to project even though her body wanted to flicker with fear. Young Drift was beside her, recording everything with the dedication of a scientist even as she faced potential extinction. Around them, thousands of Kelvin created their own light patterns, building a symphony of bioluminescence that expressed every emotion their species could feel. Ambassador Ravi Sharma stood in his environmental suit among them, the only solid form in a sea of flowing bodies. His external speakers transmitted his words as vibrations through the water. He told them that the shield was holding. He told them that humanity had kept its promise. He did not tell them that the wave would last for at least another 20 hours, or that no one knew if the array could maintain power that long without catastrophic failure. The radiation wave's intensity increased as the main body of the cosmic storm struck the shield. The lattice array blazed so brightly it was visible from neighboring star systems. Ships across the sector, some belonging to species that had mocked the project, now watched in silence as the impossible became real before their optical sensors. Warlord Scales of the Draconith hegemony stood on his command deck, his tactical display showing the energy readings from the shield. His scales, usually kept in proud display, had flattened against his body in an unconscious gesture his species made when confronting something that challenged their worldview. His weapons officer reported that the power output from the human construction was equivalent to a sustained planetary bombardment. Scales spoke quietly to his first officer, a trusted companion who had served with him for 3 decades. He said that if this shield held, if humanity succeeded in this madness, then the Draconith philosophy was wrong. Not incomplete, not merely different, wrong. Strength was not enough. Power without honor was just force without meaning. He said this as if confessing a crime. His first officer replied that perhaps some truths were worth learning even if they hurt. Scales did not respond, but he did not look away from the display. The Hive Collective's coordination swarm processed data streams from 1,000 sensors simultaneously. Their mathematical models had predicted field collapse within the first 6 hours. 8 hours passed and the shield held. 10 hours. 12. Their algorithms revised probability estimates with each passing minute. At the 15-hour mark, they transmitted a message to Earth that simply stated, "We were incorrect. The human determination coefficient is real and quantifiable. We request permission to study this phenomenon further." It was the closest thing to an apology that the Hive Collective had ever transmitted to another species. 13 hours into the bombardment, the wave reached its maximum intensity. Every warning system across the human fleet activated simultaneously. The lattice array was operating at 107% of design capacity. The fusion cores were generating heat so intense that even in vacuum, the metal frameworks around them began to glow. The quantum processors ran so hot they were approaching thermal shutdown. 3 nodes failed in the northern quadrant within seconds of each other. A gap opened in the field, a wound in the electromagnetic web that should not exist. Radiation poured through toward Tidebreak's northern hemisphere, enough to boil oceans and strip atmosphere. The gap widened as power distribution tried to compensate and failed. For 6 seconds it looked like the project would fail after all. 6 seconds where Yuki Tanaka watched her creation collapse and could do nothing but witness it. 6 seconds where Commander Olaf calculated how many Kelvin would die in the northern cities. 6 seconds where the galaxy prepared to mark Project Stellar Shield as a noble but failed attempt. Then the emergency systems activated. Yuki had designed them in secret, refusing to tell even the Oversight Committee because they would have questioned the extra cost. Hidden nodes, positioned throughout the structure but never listed in the primary documentation. Redundancies for the redundancies. Each one powered by its own fusion core, each one capable of operating independently if the main grid failed. The emergency nodes powered up and sealed the breach. The gap closed. The field re-established at full strength. The radiation that had been pouring through was deflected back into space. Tidebreak's northern hemisphere remained untouched. In the command center, Yuki collapsed forward onto her console, her body shaking with sobs she had held back for 3 years. Around her, the engineering staff broke protocol completely and erupted into cheers. Commander Olaf stood from his chair and saluted the display showing the lattice array, his expression showing respect so deep it was almost reverence. The wave continued to hammer against the shield, but the crisis point had passed. The array had proven it could handle even the worst-case scenario. Hour followed hour. The fusion cores maintained their impossible output. The quantum processors continued their real-time calculations. The electromagnetic field bent physics itself to protect one small ocean world from cosmic fury. 27 hours after the wave first struck, the intensity began to decrease. The worst of the radiation storm passed beyond the system, continuing its journey into empty space. The lattice array dimmed gradually, the field strength decreasing in controlled increments as the threat diminished. Finally, after 30 hours of continuous operation, the array stabilized into a low-power maintenance mode. The shield had held. Tidebreak was safe. Chief Engineer Yuki Tanaka transmitted the all-clear signal to every ship in the fleet. Her voice was hoarse from exhaustion and emotion. "All crews, the wave has passed. The Kelvin homeworld is secure. Mission accomplished." The response was not cheers or celebration. It was silence. 100,000 humans across hundreds of ships simply stopped and breathed. They had done it. The impossible had been achieved. An ancient debt, carried across 2 centuries, had been repaid in the only way that mattered, completely. On Tidebreak, the Kelvin exploded from their deep city trenches in a display of bioluminescent joy that could be seen from orbit. Their cities lit up in cascading waves of color, patterns that their species used to express emotions so overwhelming that words could not contain them. Young Drift's patterns flickered so rapidly that she looked like a living star. Elder Witness Mira found Ambassador Ravi Sharma in the celebration, her ancient body glowing brighter than it had in decades. The stress of impending extinction had lifted and she felt young again. Through the translation system, her voice carried a warmth that made Ravi's eyes water. She said, "You remembered. You came. You saved us. How do we thank a species who treats 200-year-old debts as yesterday's obligation?" Ravi's response was quiet but firm. He said that no thanks were needed. Humanity had simply done what the Kelvin taught them to do. They had valued life over calculation, honor over convenience, and promise over profit. If the Kelvin wanted to thank anyone, they should thank their own ancestors who had shown humanity what civilization truly meant. Mira's patterns shifted to colors that meant something like laughter mixed with tears. She said that perhaps the greatest gift species could give each other was not technology or territory, but the courage to be better than logic demanded. Above them, through miles of water, the lattice array continued its gentle glow. A web of light and human determination that had bent the universe itself rather than break a promise. Scribe Hollowbone recorded it all from his observation sphere. In his later writings, which would be studied across the galaxy for centuries, he included a personal note that broke from his usual clinical documentation style. He wrote, "I have witnessed the impossible today, not because physics was violated, but because a species decided that some things were worth any cost. The humans did not build a shield. They built proof that civilization requires more than technology. It requires souls willing to remember, and the courage to honor what they remember. Today they proved that such things exist." 3 months after the radiation wave passed, the Galactic Assembly convened a special session unlike any in its recorded history. The location alone was unprecedented, on Tidebreak itself in massive environmental domes constructed on the ocean floor. Most assembly delegates could not breathe water, so the engineering required to accommodate hundreds of different species in the Kelvin homeworld's depths had taken weeks to complete. Ambassador Ravi Sharma descended through the water in a transparent transport pod, watching the Kelvin cities glow in the distance like constellations underwater. Beside him sat Director Paulo Mendez, Chief Engineer Yuki Tanaka, and Commander Olaf Hansen. The human delegation expected formal thanks, perhaps trade agreements to help rebuild Earth's devastated economy, maybe even technological exchanges that would advance human development. They had no idea what the Kelvin had actually prepared. The assembly chamber was a marvel of engineering, a massive dome where environmental zones allowed dozens of species to exist in adjacent spaces. The Draconith occupied heated platforms. The Stoneheart Collective rested on reinforced foundations that could support their massive crystalline bodies. The Hive Collective swarmed in a contained atmospheric sphere, and in the center, in the water that was their natural element, the Kelvin gathered in thousands. Elder Witness Mira addressed the assembly, her aged body glowing with renewed vitality. The stress of impending extinction had lifted, and she looked decades younger despite her ancient age. Her bioluminescent patterns were translated into speech that filled the chamber through 100 different translation systems. She began by acknowledging the obvious. Humanity believed they had repaid a debt. They had sacrificed years of development, bankrupted their economy, and pushed themselves to the absolute limits of their capabilities to save a species that logic said could not be saved. They had proven that honor and memory could overcome probability itself. But they were wrong, Mira continued, to think this made them even. The 37 Kelvin scientists who died on Europa had given their lives knowing it was the right thing to do. Humanity had given their resources, their time, and yes, even some of their lives, knowing it was the right thing to do. Both actions were priceless because both were given freely. No amount of gratitude could truly balance such equations. However, the Kelvin were one of the galaxy's oldest species. They had existed for 400,000 years, and their culture held memory as sacred. They remembered everything, every kindness, every betrayal, every moment of significance in their long history. And they had been waiting for 200 years, wondering if they would ever find a species worthy of their greatest treasure. Mira gestured to the ancient city structures visible through the dome's transparent walls. The oldest parts, she explained, were not buildings at all. They were archives. The memory archives, maintained by specialized caretaker clans, contained complete records of galactic history spanning hundreds of thousands of years. Technologies from civilizations now extinct, star charts of regions the current galaxy had forgotten, medical knowledge that could cure diseases across a dozen species, agricultural techniques developed by cultures that had mastered feeding billions, energy systems that made current fusion technology look primitive. The assembly chamber fell silent. Even species that had existed for tens of thousands of years had never heard of these archives. The Kelvin, peaceful and focused on art and mathematics, had been hiding the accumulated knowledge of geological ages in their deepest trenches. Mira's patterns shifted to colors that meant both joy and solemnity. The Kelvin had never shared this knowledge, she explained, because most species would weaponize it, They would use ancient technologies to dominate others, or exploit medical knowledge for profit rather than healing. The galaxy was full of species that valued power over compassion, efficiency over ethics. But humanity had been tested, not intentionally but by circumstance and their own choices. They had been given the choice between their own prosperity and honoring an ancient debt. They had chosen honor. They had been given the choice between logic and loyalty. They had chosen loyalty. They had proven beyond any doubt that they valued life over profit and promises over convenience. The archives were theirs. All of it. Complete access to 400,000 years of accumulated galactic knowledge. The assembly erupted. Species that had existed for millennia suddenly realized they were about to become obsolete. Humanity, a species barely 3 centuries into space travel, would have access to technologies and knowledge that would catapult them centuries ahead of everyone else. The balance of power in the galaxy would shift overnight. Warlord Scales of the Draconith hegemony rose from his heated platform, his scales fully extended in a display his species used for challenges. But when he spoke, his words were not a challenge. They were an offer. The Draconith wished to propose a military alliance with humanity, he announced. On equal terms. Something the hegemony had never offered to any other species in their 10,000-year history. The Hive Collective's swarm pulsed with coordinated movement that indicated deep processing. They transmitted a request to study human organizational methods, admitting that their calculations had been missing variables they did not know existed. They wanted to understand how emotion and determination could be quantified, because clearly it affected outcomes in ways their mathematics had never accounted for. Species after species lined up to speak. Some offered trade agreements on favorable terms. Others proposed cultural exchanges. The Stoneheart Collective, their crystalline forms chiming like massive bells, rumbled their approval. They said they had watched civilizations rise and fall for millions of years, and most followed predictable patterns. Rise through innovation, peak through conquest or trade, fall through corruption or conflict. Perhaps humanity would be different. Perhaps memory and loyalty were evolutionary advantages that could break the cycle. But Mira was not finished. She raised a tendril to quiet the assembly, her patterns requesting silence. There was one condition to the gift, she explained. Only one, but it was not negotiable. Humanity must teach other species what the Kelvin had taught them. That debts matter across centuries. That honor exists and has value beyond calculation. That some things are worth more than profit or power. Humanity must become the galaxy's memory keepers alongside the Kelvin, reminding civilizations that true advancement required more than technology. It required heart. Director Paulo Mendez stood to respond. His weathered face showed the strain of 3 years spent fighting impossible odds, but his voice was steady and clear. He said that humanity accepted this gift with humility, not as a species that deserved it, but as a species that would strive every day to deserve it. He made a promise on behalf of all humanity. As long as their species existed, the story of 37 Kelvin scientists would be taught to every human child. The Europa incident would never be forgotten, never reduced to a footnote in history texts, and every human would learn that civilization was not measured in military strength or economic power, but in the courage to honor promises even when it cost everything. He added one more thing. Humanity requested permission to leave the lattice array in place permanently, not just as protection for tidebreak, but as a monument. Let it serve as a reminder to every species that visited that memory matters, that loyalty has power, that some debts are worth any price to repay. The Kelvin agreed immediately. The lattice array would remain, and it would be open to visitors from across the galaxy. Already they had chosen its new name, the Monument of Remembrance. The session ended with every species present voting to establish a new galactic institution, the Council of Remembered Debts. Its purpose would be to document and honor acts of selfless sacrifice across the galaxy, to ensure that such deeds were never forgotten. Humanity and the Kelvin would lead it together, but membership would be open to any species that proved they understood the value of memory over convenience. 5 years passed. On Earth, in a classroom in what used to be called California, teacher Helen Rodriguez taught her students about galactic history. The children sat in holographic environments that showed them the Europa incident in vivid detail. They watched the Kelvin scientists enter the failing reactor. They learned all 37 names. They saw the construction of the lattice array and heard interviews with workers who had been there. One student raised his hand. His name was Marcus, and he was 9 years old. He asked the question that every generation of human children would ask: why did we spend so much to save them? We could have just helped them evacuate and saved a lot of money. Helen smiled. She had been waiting for this question. She pulled up the final image from her lesson, the monument of remembrance glowing in orbit above tidebreak. Ships from across the galaxy visited it daily, and on its central node, inscribed in every known galactic language, were 37 names and a simple phrase in human English. She read the phrase aloud: "We remember. We return. We never forget." Then she explained. Humanity had spent everything to save the Kelvin because some things could not be measured in credits or resources. Power was not just military might or economic strength. True power was keeping promises even when it cost everything. True power was remembering across centuries and acting on that memory. True power was proving to the galaxy that civilization required more than just technology. The Kelvin had taught humanity what honor looked like. Humanity had shown the galaxy what remembering meant, and now, together, they were teaching other species that the foundation of any real civilization was not strength or efficiency, but the courage to value what truly mattered. Marcus seemed satisfied with that answer. Another student asked about the archives, about what humanity had learned from them. Helen pulled up images of the new medical facilities that were using ancient Kelvin knowledge to cure diseases that had plagued dozens of species. She showed them the agricultural projects that were ending hunger on human colonies. She displayed the faster-than-light drive improvements that had doubled travel speeds. But she made sure they understood. The knowledge was a gift, not a prize. Humanity had not saved the Kelvin to get something in return. They had saved the Kelvin because it was right. The archives came after, as recognition that they had proven themselves worthy of such trust. She ended the lesson the way she ended every history class, with a question for the students to consider. What will you do when it is your turn? When you face a choice between what is easy and what is right, between what profits you and what honors others, how will you prove that your generation understands what it means to be human? The children left thinking. Some would forget the lesson by the next day. Others would carry it for the rest of their lives. And a few, like young Marcus, would grow up to join the Council of Remembered Debts, spending their careers documenting acts of sacrifice and ensuring the galaxy never forgot. Above tidebreak, the Monument of Remembrance continued its eternal orbit. Ships from hundreds of species visited regularly, their crews walking through the lattice structure and reading the names inscribed on the central node. The Kelvin maintained it carefully, keeping every component in perfect condition. It had become a pilgrimage site, a place where species came to remember that they were capable of more than their base natures suggested. Young Drift, no longer so young, now served as the monument's chief historian. She gave tours to visiting dignitaries and school groups, telling the story of the impossible shield to generation after generation. In her office, she kept her original research notes from when she had first observed humans working in space. She sometimes reread her most famous line: "They build with memory and promise, and perhaps such materials are stronger than we ever imagined." She had been right. Memory and promise had proven stronger than cosmic forces. They had bent the universe itself rather than break a commitment made 2 centuries earlier. Ambassador Ravi Sharma, now retired but still active in diplomatic circles, sometimes visited the monument with his grandchildren. He would stand at the central node and tell them about elder witness Mira, about the conversations they had shared in the deep trenches before the wave arrived. He told them that Mira had lived another decade after humanity saved tidebreak, long enough to see the Council of Remembered Debts established and functioning. Before she died, she had sent Ravi one final message. It said, "You asked me once how to thank a species that remembers. I have finally found the answer, by remembering them in return." The Kelvin will teach their children about humanity for the next 400,000 years, if we survive that long. We will tell them that once, when we needed salvation, humans came, not because it was profitable, not because it was easy, but because they had promised themselves they would. That is the greatest gift one species can give another, proof that honor exists and has power. The galaxy had changed in 5 years, not in its physical structure, but in something more fundamental. The Council of Remembered Debts had documented over 1,000 acts of sacrifice across hundreds of species. Some were large, like humanity's effort. Others were small. A merchant who ruined himself helping a stranded crew. A scientist who shared breakthrough research freely rather than selling it. A soldier who died protecting civilians of a species not his own. Each one was recorded, honored, and taught. Slowly, the galaxy was learning that strength alone did not define civilization, that some things mattered more than profit margins and power projection. That memory, loyalty, and honor were not weaknesses but foundations. The monument of remembrance orbited tidebreak under twin moons, its lattice of light visible from the surface. The stars shone through it unchanged, but the galaxy looking at those stars had transformed. Humanity had given the Kelvin their world back. The Kelvin had given humanity the knowledge of ages. Together, they had given the galaxy something more valuable than either: hope that civilization could be better than survival of the strongest. And somewhere in that web of light and memory and promise kept, the future took shape, a future where debts remembered across centuries mattered, where honor was power, where humanity's return gift had indeed shaken the stars, not with weapons or conquest, but with the simple, revolutionary act of keeping a promise. The lesson spread. Species watched and learned. And the galaxy, ancient and vast and often cruel, discovered that it still had room for something it had almost forgotten. Civilizations that chose to be more than just successful. Civilizations that chose to be good.